This is the video camera operator. This is tape number 2 of the testimony of Elgin Vestal. We have now changed after hour 45, tape number 1. Please begin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vestal.
Good afternoon.
If you would turn just for a moment to your 1954 report on page 94.
I have it, thank you.
There is a statement oh, I can't find it.
You said page 94.
Yes. And you were talking about cutthroat trout being introduced, and then you say, but apparently had little effect on the brown trout population, which was by that time said to be producing excellent fishing in Lower Rush Creek. Was it your opinion, the time that you wrote this article, that the brown trout population was producing excellent fishery in the Lower Rush Creek by 1932?
Yes, but by that time, the dominance of the brown trout was making itself felt, and the brown trout population was upbuilding to the point where it contributed to a very marked degree to the fishing.
And in the letter that Mr. Birmingham was asking you about that you wrote in 1941, there is a reference to excellent trout fishing that you had seen in the stream on May 1st of the prior year, which would be 1940. And the fact that the lower section of Rush Creek, when given a chance, is highly productive of aquatic foods for trout. Is it your opinion that those are accurate statements regarding the fishery in approximately 1940?
Yes, I believe that would be I believe that would be an accurate statement. That implies sufficient flows and so on to conducive to the development of bottom foods and a productive stream.
Could you briefly describe the area below what you call the gorge, and we tend now to call the narrows, with regard to the conditions that made that area good habitat for fish?
The section below the gorge was, first of all, it was a much lower gradient. It was considerably lower gradient than the segment, the reach above. There were meanders, good gravels. There was certainly good food production. While we didn't carry on a survey of the bottom foods, we did check enough sufficient stomachs going through the station, the checking station, to indicate there was a variety. There were at least 12 different kinds of bottom foods in the section. You had the inflow from the springs to the meadows, and certainly the production there that was contributed by the watercress beds. The riparian cover was anchored and likened it to a certain jungle, but nevertheless that jungle contributed a shower of terrestrial organisms and foods to the stream, and I think that the stream was not subject to violent flows or anything like that. I think that the temperatures were certainly favorable for brown trout, which I indicated earlier soon dominated that section of the stream. As you got down to including the meanders, as you got down toward the lower part of the stream, you had what I interpreted to be a sort of a raceway contribution, a downstream drift of organisms, and this situation where the larger trout were taking advantage of that and also foraging out from the freshwater lens out into, for short distances, out into the lake to take advantage of the shrimp and flies.
And were there pools in what you call the delta area, which is the area immediately upstream of Mono Lake?
Yes, there were a number of pools in there, up to 4 to 5 feet at one stage.
And did you have any indication that there were large fish in those pools?
Yes, the inference was, while we did not actually see these trout in Mr. Dombrowski and I, when we saw them, and another time I saw them with the chief of the Bureau of Fish Conservation, Mr. Taft. Fish would rise, they would dimple on the surface and grab food on the surface, and as they rose and swirl, you could tell that they were large fish. These were fish 18 to 20 inches, pretty broad-tailed and pretty good-sized trout.
And was Mr. Dombrowski's place in that portion of Rush Creek?
Mr. Dombrowski's residence, and he lived in the J.B. Clover place, was above the county road, which was above that delta portion. It was on the south side of the road as you approach the bridge across Lower Rush Creek.
And did he conduct fishing, or did he allow angling on his property, and did those people go down into the delta?
The people that came through Rush Creek Ranch,
and Rush Creek Ranch is another way of referring to Mr. Dombrowski's property?
That property, yes, which synonymous with the Clover property. I never actually knew of the fee basis, but Rush Creek Ranch was operated on that basis, and they would go down there and fish that section of stream.
And were there accounts of large trout being taken?
Yes, they were certainly reported. Walt had told me at one point of trout that had been taken and were caught there, and we had a visitor at Culver's Camp in 1939. His name was Fred Gill, who was a director from Hollywood, who was a superb fly fisherman, and that was one of the areas where he fly fished and took large trout out of Rush Creek.
And when you say large trout,
I'm
in
talking
that
about,
context?
in his case, the fish were up to 2 pounds. I don't recall from my contact with him any fish caught over 2 pounds, but those were pretty good sized fish.
Let's talk just briefly about the sheep and the grazing. Did the grazing typically have a temporary impact or a relatively long-term impact on your test section?
In my opinion, the impact of the grazing was short range. It was temporary, as I indicated earlier. The sheep men would, I may have indicated earlier, the sheep men would move their stock in for watering and keep them there for a few hours and then move them on out into the basin for their forage. There was no, other than the highlining of where the stock would yard for a short time of the willows, there was no indication of bank destruction or stream bottom destruction by the sheep, since the herders knew that we had a project there, and they were I thought they were considered and cooperative, and of course they knew Mr. Dombrowski, and there was a rapport there which went through to the Basque herders to control their animals and such that they didn't.
If you could turn to the picture, the photograph that's marked as Cow Trout Exhibit 5O.
Yes, I have it.
Was that picture taken in your test stretch?
No, well, yes, it was taken just inside the very lower end of the test stretch on the east side of the road, just below the bridge, looking down toward the delta. You can actually see Mono Lake and one of Dombrowski's duck mines there in the picture.
And aside from the fact that the willows are highlined, is there other evidence in this photograph of overgrazing?
I see none. I see evidence of higher water, but I see no bank destruction there from overgrazing. Matter of fact, we're looking down in an area where I am quite sure that the herders did not graze.
So do you see anything in this photograph that would be grazing related that would have an impact on the fishery in this stretch?
No, I do not.
Okay, let's turn to the picture that's Cow Trout 5P.
Yes, I have it.
Now, was this photograph within your test reach?
Yes, it was.
And do you see impacts of overgrazing in this photograph?
Other than the willows, even the willows on the right in the right middle foreground, there's no excessive highline by the sheep there. I do see some highlining in the middle background there, center and to the left, but I see no bank destruction from grazing.
And does the bank appear to have been trampled, or is there
It's
any?
not.
I'm sorry. Does the bank appear to be trampled?
No, it does not appear to be crushed or trampled as a result of
And is there any apparent undercutting by water of the bank?
Yes, there on the right, on the right edge of the photograph, about the middle, it shows undercutting over in some of the overhang of grasses and so on there, and it looks like over on the left here, there just about 2 inches out from the left cover, there's some undercutting there, and right in nearing the center, there's some undercutting there from high water.
Because of the videotaping, I think what we need to say is when you were saying there on the left, you mean basically starting at the left edge of the picture, about 2/3 of the way from the bottom.
That's
and extending
correct.
out.
That is correct.
And then in the center would be beyond that.
That is correct.
All right, let's turn to the photograph there's one more. It's Cow Trout Exhibit 5M.
Yes, I have it.
Where was this photograph taken?
This picture was taken down below the test section, below, as a matter of fact, below the weir, the weir and trap. On the right, looking toward Mono Lake on the right bank of the stream, and into the delta reach, showing one of the meanders on the left edge of the photograph, up about midway, and indication of other meanders down into the delta, and then to the right as the main channel swung over and entered Mono Lake.
To your knowledge, was there any grazing in this area?
To my knowledge, there was no grazing. We would have seen it. I'm sure that Mr. Conway knew of the project and was quite cooperative. But I knew of, nor was it reported by any of my men, that grazing was permitted in this area.
In the area around Highway 395, did you see riparian vegetation decline or die in the years following Los Angeles's beginning diversions?
You're speaking of Rush Creek.
In Rush Creek.
In Rush Creek, yes. By the time I left to enter the military, this was beginning to occur, but it was most marked in 1946 after I returned. It was one of the, it was quite disturbing to notice what had happened there. As a result of desiccation, dead black cottonwoods, and down especially below old 395 trees that were left that were dead. The foliage was rusty colored, and it was very obvious that it was a dying situation.
Okay, prior to 1940, prior to diversions, was that stretch of the channel intact in terms of channel morphology and riparian vegetation?
Principally, yes.
Just one last question. When Mr. Birmingham first informed you of a proposal to release 35 CFS with no diversions from Parker and Walker, did you understand that that was the recommendation made by the Department of Fish and Game as a result of its stream studies?
Yes, this is my understanding.
And if I were to tell you...
Excuse me, maybe I can...
Sorry, go ahead.
This was my understanding, recommendations from the department's contract, IFMIM studies.
And have you in fact seen the department's recommendations?
I have seen them. I haven't, yes, I have seen the recommendations.
And if, I think, if I were to inform you that those in fact were not the department's recommendations, but the recommendations of Los Angeles, would that have affected your answer?
In other words...
Well, I think there was a mistake in understand. Were you in fact, was there a mistake in understanding when you answered that question?
I believe there was. I did not know this.
Thank you. Okay, I have no further questions.
All right, Ms. Cahill has come in at 17 minutes.
I've got my 3, I think. Use a few, couple duck questions. Sir, just a couple of quick duck questions. Mr. Vestal, you indicated that you were hunting in 1940 on the edge of Mona Lake. Is that correct?
That's correct. On it was the 6th of October, 1940, with Walt, and I must say it was a new experience.
And is October the time that one would expect to see ducks at Mona Lake?
Well, ducks were beginning to come in. There were certainly a lot of ducks there at that time, and Walt was a superb caller. He knew his waterfowl, and we exchanged views on the differences between waterfowl and phalaropes and the other birds, the shorebirds and so on, the grebes, for example. And he could call in. I was amazed at how he could use his hands and his vocalization to call ducks in toward our stance.
And did these ducks migrate away from Mona Lake eventually? Did they stay there all
Well,
winter?
it was my understanding even before at that time that this was an integral part. Mona Lake was an integral part of the Pacific Flyway, and I was quite interested in Walt's participation in maintaining records and so on, and his method of checkerboarding and making counts, and the numbers that waterfowl that I observed certainly coincided with his estimates of the tens of thousands of waterfowl that were present there on the lake later in the season in wintertime, late fall and winter.
Now, you later transferred across the Sierra to the Fresno office, is that correct?
Yes.
And you testified you had the opportunity to see birds at Grizzly Island and Merced and Los Banos, is that correct?
Yes.
And,
I even shot at Los Banos.
and are these important California waterfowl areas?
Yes, they are. Yes, I had made several trips to Los Banos in particular when Wattenberger was there, and got fairly well acquainted with Los Banos.
And is the basis of your estimates of populations at Mono Lake and your comparison formed as a result of your viewing some of these other waterfowl areas?
I must say that at none of these other areas did I see the numbers of waterfowl that had gathered at Mono Lake. I'm not saying that the sky, I would say that the sky was blackened, but certainly there were thousands of ducks in the air at one time, and yet there were ducks on the like the Rushwick Delta, for example, on the water surface. So and even rafted out on the lake, there were just tens of thousands of waterfowl, ducks.
And you were familiar with the department's methodology of counting and estimating ducks?
Well, I became familiar with, it was my understanding that during the flights here in this region, that they use this system of checkerboard. And that, in other words...
you mean the Yountville area?
The Yountville area,
Right.
yes, out of Yountville headquarters of Region 3, that they would see a water area, and they would, Gil Thompson was one of the men, you remember Gil, waterfowl biologist, a good wildlife biologist, very learned in terms of waterfowl. He would observe a portion of a body of water and then scan that in terms, they had a scan system for checkerboarding, and then he would estimate the rest of the area and by multiplication come up with his estimate of the population.
And did Mr. Dombrowski use a similar
He used
methodology?
almost the same technique. That's when I first became acquainted with it, and I used the term checkerboarding on that basis.
And you were later to understand from your work in the other parts of the state that that was a proper methodology for counting ducks?
Well, it was certainly used. I don't know what the guidelines were within the department, but it was certainly a method that was used, and they came up with some pretty good results.
Okay, thanks. I have no further questions.
How much did Cahill have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, so we've added another 5.5 minutes to the Department of Fish and Game.
Bruce, are you planning to do redirect now?
Yeah, I have some questions.
Okay, I have a few questions on cross first.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Enough's enough.
Hello, Mr. Vestal. I'm Dan Frank, as we
Yes.
introduced ourselves earlier. I'm
My pleasure.
with the State Water Resources Control Board. I just have a few questions. Before I ask them, I'd like to say, on behalf of the board, we greatly appreciate you making yourself available for the deposition in view of your inability to attend the hearing in Sacramento. It's greatly appreciated that
Thank
you've been
you.
willing to spend your afternoon with us today.
Thank you.
I just have a couple of questions, and some of this you have touched on in various ways. The first one, I wonder if you could briefly summarize how you believe the condition of the lower Rice Creek fishery in the period from 1947 to 1950 compared with the condition of the fishery in Lower Rice Creek prior to 1940?
From 1947 to 1950, there was a, this would be the section between the Narrows and on down. In that period, there was a condition of increasing constriction. And deterioration. There was, in other words, the conditions were changing as a result of the diminution in flows from the springs, and we were headed toward, ultimately, very, very close to, in 1951, to extinction.
And how does that compare with the condition before 1940?
It was a much, before 1940, it was a much better habitat. The springs were running as much as, contributing as much as 24 second feet, according to our records, at least that. I know of no instance where they were any greater than that. But it was a much better habitat. It was a more complete habitat from the standpoint of a fish population. There were excellent gravels, excellent spawning areas, food-producing areas. There was the springs had these watercress beds, or rills, and streams tributary to Rush Creek. It was contributing to a much better, at that time, a much better habitat.
All right, thank you. I know your primary area of work in the Mono Basin was in fisheries, but your testimony mentioned your background as a bird watcher and the fact that you lived in the basin a number of years. Did you have much or any experience in waterfowl management after leaving the Mono Basin in 1950?
No, I had no experience in waterfowl management. I kept up an interest through library and publications produced by the department. I was familiar with work of some of the men in Sacramento office, and so I tried to keep up with what was going on. But I had no experience in waterfowl management.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Mr. Vestal, I just have a few follow-up questions. In response to questions by Mr. Roos Collins, you were talking about 1932, the brown trout were gradually dominating, and that Rush Creek had favorable habitat for them. And then you testified to changes occurred from developments in the system, changes to the habitat. To what did you refer?
I was referring to the gradual downtrend in the habitat. We're referring now to the section between the Narrows and the lower end of that reach of Mole Lake. I was referring to the downtrend in the habitat as a result of the diminution of flows from any source.
As a result of the diversions, then?
That's correct.
Now bear with me, I'm just going to go through my notes here. I just have a limited number of questions. In response to questions, I believe by Mr. Birmingham, relating to Rush Creek below the Narrows pre-diversion, he asked you questions about whether there was a single channel. Do you recall those questions, sir?
Yes, I do, and
Let me ask you a specific question. Isn't it true pre-diversions below the gorge that in places Rush Creek had multiple channels?
Yes, this is true. I was probably recalling at that moment the published map that we put in the 1954 report, which showed essentially a single channel, and one purpose for that was not to confuse the fishermen, since we had a paper that was issued to them as far as their access and their use. But it's true that there were meanders in places in the channel between the gorge and at least the upper bridge.
And were these meanders watered even at less than flood flows?
The meanders were probably, yes, they were watered up higher up in the reach as a result, primarily as a result of the inflow from the springs, which permeated the meadow, and see, Bowler Creek came down through there, and I think a portion of them were watered, but not all. This is what I'm trying to remember, what proportion of them. There would be some of these that were watered.
Now, you had questions from Ms. Cahill about the conditions pre-diversions below the gorge, and you described those conditions. And I don't want you to repeat that testimony, but on several occasions you've talked about the springs below the narrows. And I
Yes.
want you to focus specifically on your opinion on the effect of the springs on the trout habitat and trout populations in that area.
The effects were multiple. The springs contributed almost right up to the lakes. They contributed in their rills and the gravels through those rills. They contributed spawning areas for areas that were sought out by Eastern Brook and to some extent the brown trout. They contributed an abundance through the dense watercress beds. They contributed an abundance of foods. Paul Needham missed a good bet when he did not see fit to explore the spring areas and watercress beds of Lower Rush Creek in comparison with the glorified areas that he touted in Hot Creek. It was a good bet, at least early on, as a possible hatchery site. They contributed temperatures, lower temperatures as a result of the water coming out of the springs, which helped maintain a lower temperature gradient in that reach of Rush Creek. The springs were a lifesaver. They were a mainstay, a lifesaver for Rush Creek during that period.
Also, in response to Ms. Cahill, you spoke of pools in the delta, and you said 4 feet to 5 feet. Is that a reference to depth, sir?
There were several pools in there which that were as low as at least 4 feet and may have gone to 5 feet. They were quite deep. I don't know of any, I know of no measurements, but the inference on that was the type of currents and the rolling of water, and of course the appearance of these large fish coming up out of a deeper area. onto the surface.
Okay, my final question is just, perhaps my notes are just inaccurate, but I'd like you to look at this picture CT50, which I believe you told us was at the low end of the test stretch. It's the one I believe you testified shows
I have
a
it.
duck blind.
I have it, yes.
Now, you do agree that there's highlining of the willows, don't you, sir?
That's correct.
So there, at least on occasion, there was some grazing in this area, isn't that true?
Well, there may have been sight unseen in order to cause that, because some highlighting does show.
So your testimony was that
That
it
there
was
was
not a
no-
common area for grazing?
It was not a common area for grazing, no.
That's
We
all.
we would have known that. We would have we would have observed it. We would have observed it, I'm sure. The checking station being as close as it was to that area, had the sheep been ranged there in the daytime, and I'm sure that they weren't ranged overnight.
Thank you, Mr. Vestal. I have no further questions.
Mr. Vestal, I have several more questions for you. Let me begin with a housekeeping detail. Attached to your written testimony are exhibits CalTrout 5A through 5T. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
To the best of your knowledge, are these attachments true and correct copies of the originals?
That is correct.
And you use these attachments in preparing your written testimony?
That's right.
Thank you. Let me ask that you turn to paragraph 22 on page 9 of your written testimony. You previously discussed this paragraph with Mr. Birmingham.
Yes, I have it.
Before LADWP began diversions from Rush Creek, did the trout migrate from Upper Rush Creek through Grant Dam into Lower Rush Creek?
They could have. They could have during spill times. It was possible, but we had no direct evidence of this, but they could have. They may have.
Paragraphs 25 and 26 on page 10 discuss the Trout Hatchery located above Grant Dam on Rush Creek.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
What is the relevance, in your opinion, of the egg production in Upper Rush Creek as a measure of the fishery below Grant Dam?
Well, I think that I would say that the situation above Grant Dam in terms of this protection was at that time, and the egg through the egg taking station, the number of eggs and so on was really astounding. This was certainly the result of recruitment, annual recruitment out of Grant Lake and up into Upper Rush Creek. There wasn't, there just wasn't the opportunity for long-range migration of the cutthroat from Lower Rush Creek up into proper spawning. I don't have any knowledge or evidence that as alternative paths that they ever used, that is, in later years, certainly not after diversion began into Walker and Parker Creek. They may have historically. There were no barriers in any of these tributaries, and that included Rush Creek, but they may have, it is quite possible they migrated well up into Walker and Parker Creek as well, but after that time, their migrations, upstream migrations, were cut off from Lower Rush Creek into the upper reaches.
After which time?
After 1925, when the dam height was the higher dam was built, a larger outlet structure.
Let me ask you finally about...
Richard, can we take a break for a second?
Yes, sir.
And step outside and confer?
This is the video camera operator. We're not going off the record.
On the record?
Are we on the record now?
This is the video camera operator. We're now back on the record. Please continue.
The attorneys took a short break, and we're I think, persuaded that this has been a tough day for Mr. Vestal, and it's best to stop the examination at this point. We've agreed that we can use this testimony in the water board hearing. We've also agreed that Mr. Vestal has testified under oath before Judge Finney in the spring of 1990, and that testimony can be used to the extent relevant in the water board hearing. And Mr. Birmingham has indicated that he has a few additional questions for Mr. Vestal, and if he decides at some point to pursue those questions with Mr. Vestal, subject to Mr. Vestal's availability, that we would reconvene a deposition as appropriate, but that we're all hopeful that that will be unnecessary. So I think with that, we want to conclude today's session.
Let me add two things. First, Mr. Vestal, thank you for your clear and complete testimony, notwithstanding your medical condition. All parties are very grateful for it.
Thank you.
And let me also thank Dan Frank for his presence. We're grateful that the board allowed us to conduct this examination by deposition, and we're grateful for Mr. Frank's presence here.
This is the video camera operator. This concludes the deposition of Ellen Vestal. This is the end of tape number 2.